Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Raise the Vibe with Liz. I'm your host, Liz Peterson, and Janice Holden is joining me again. I'm so excited to have Dr. Jan join me again for this fantastic conversation. We're going to be discussing nearing death awareness and after-death communication, and I'm so glad to have her back with me for Raise the Vibe with Liz. So let me start off for those of you who didn't get a chance to listen to her talk on near-death experiences that we did before. I want to read a little bit about who Jan is. So Dr. Jan Holden, after earning her Doctor of Education degree in counselor education in 1988, her primary research focus has been near-death experiences, after-death communication, and other transpersonal experiences, those that transcend the usual personal limits of space, time, and identity. In this research area, she has over 50 referred journal publications and over 100 national and international presentations. Dr. Holden currently serves as president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and since 2008, she has served as editor-in-chief of that association's peer-reviewed scholarly journal, Journal of Near-Death Studies. Dr. Jan, welcome to the show again.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks for having me back.
So great to have you back. So we're going to jump right into it. I know there are a variety of experiences or paranormal experiences around death, having just experienced that with my mother in February and beyond. It still happens to this day. So what are some of those experiences that you could share with our audience?
Yeah, well, as you said, there are a variety of them. And just as a few samples, as a person who's terminally ill is approaching death, there's a phenomenon called nearing death awareness. And that it's usually witnessed by the people who are at the dying person's deathbed. And the dying person gets dreams, visions, something where they seem to be connected to one or more entities that are not of the material world and seem to be there to be presenting themselves to help the person make the transition from this existence to the next. And so it's not uncommon for a dying person to be lying, let's say, maybe asleep or unconscious on their deathbed, and suddenly they come to awake consciousness, and they're looking in the distance. They might reach out, they might have conversation with, and of course the person at the deathbed is hearing only the dying person's side of the conversation, but the dying person seems to be having a conversation with it could be a deceased loved one who's coming back for them, or it could be another spiritual entity that is again seeming to help them cross the veil, so to speak. And so these experiences tend to be very reassuring for the person who experiences them. Like, there are a lot of cases where the dying person seems anxious about their impending death, and then they have one of these experiences, and after that they're completely calm and fine with the impending transition. And they also can be, if the person who's there at the deathbed is open to accepting these experiences as being, psychologically and spiritually beneficial, it can benefit them because they see that that their loved one is not going to die alone, that they're going to be met and accompanied and cared for, and so it also can influence the witness's own beliefs about where the dying person is going to go, and that they are going to continue to exist in another state. And so that can be very comforting as well. So that's a little taste into nearing death awareness. Sometimes dying people have dreams that are helpful in this kind of way, and yeah, so dreams, visions, things like that. And then closer to the actual physically dying process, as opposed to, the implication that the person is dead and gone. It's more that their body has died. People have shared death experiences. And this is, again, a person at a deathbed of a terminally ill person who shares in some way in that person's dying process. And so some people have said that sometimes things manifest in the room, like at the moment that the dying person takes their last breath, the room becomes filled with light and this sense of peace and love that is just all pervading. And then that lasts for maybe, I don't know, 30 seconds, a couple minutes, and then it fades. But the memory of that experience, really stays with the witness. And in some cases, the attendant at the deathbed actually has a psychospiritual experience of beginning to accompany their deceased loved one. So they might have the experience, they're sitting there just kind of maybe daydreaming or whatever, just being with their dying loved one. And suddenly they experience themselves out of their body with their dying loved one in the first stages of what sounds a lot like a near-death experience, where the dying loved one is going toward a light, and the witness is going with them. And then they might, for example, get to a point where the dying person is met by some entity and turns and says to the living person, I'm going on now, and I need to go. And the implication being that the living person can't go. And then the living person is suddenly back in their body, and they open their eyes and their loved one has physically died. And so, of course, that can be profoundly comforting as well, because a sense of really having a sense of the peace and wellness, when the dying person leaves their body, they're whole and functioning completely. They might have had, in fact, this is another phenomenon I'll mention in a minute. They might have had some long-term disability that is gone once they leave their body. And so there can be a lot of levels of comfort in experiences like that. One of the ones that I just thought of that I forgot to mention is called, it has different names, but one of the names has been called terminal lucidity. And it's terminal because it's people who are terminally ill. And the lucidity is that they've had a long-term cognitive disability, like, for example, Alzheimer's, and they have been incommunicative sometimes for years. And suddenly on their deathbed, usually within hours or not more than a couple of days before the physical death, the person is awake, alert, and they're fully back. And they have lucid conversations with their the living caregivers, and they know things that have happened during a time when everybody thought that they were just completely checked out. And so and usually, again, this lasts a short time, and then the person lapses back into the disability and then dies physically shortly thereafter. But this also happens not only with cognitive disability, but with physical disability, where someone who has been paralyzed suddenly is able to have full movement in just the period prior to their physical death.
Wow.
And so there's just a lot of speculation about, what's going on there, except that these experiences definitely point to that we are more than the limitations of our physical bodies. We're much more than that. And then we talked about shared death experiences, and then beginning at the moment of death and for any period afterwards, although usually most often in the year following the death, there's after-death communication. And that's where the living person has the experience of the presence of the deceased loved one. And there's a whole lot to say about after-death communication as a topic. There's a lot to say about each of these things in and of themselves. Yes. But just to say a few things about after-death communication, it actually occurs to both grieving and non-grieving people. So there are lots of cases of people who had after-death communication who were not in the process of grieving the deceased loved one. Like one of my favorite, like one of the themes that can happen is protection or rescue theme. And in this case, which came from the book Hello from Heaven by Bill Guggenheim and Judy Guggenheim. This woman is driving home from work one day. She gets to the stop sign of her normal route home, and suddenly she hears her father's voice, and he had died like 10 years before, and she was not actively grieving him, but she hears his voice very clearly say, "Turn right, right here, right now." So she turns right, and that's not how she normally goes home. And so then she's on that route and she's thinking, okay, now how am I going to get home? So she has to take this, much longer circuitous route, and she finally arrives home, takes off her coat, pours herself a glass of wine, turns on the TV, and sees that the route that she normally takes home, which involves crossing a bridge, that bridge collapsed, and several people went into the ravine and died before anybody knew what was happening and they could stop the traffic.
Wow.
And if she had taken her normal route home, she might have been one of those cars. So it was absolutely a protective, message, that didn't involve her grieving. But many of the people who have after-death communication are in the process of grieving their loved one. And the communication can happen. It can take any of a number of forms. Actually, most common is a feeling, a very distinct, definite feeling of the presence of the deceased loved one with no other sensory cue at all. You're not seeing them, hearing them, anything like that. You just know they're there. You feel it. And but they can take a sensory form where the deceased loved one is seen, either like you and I are seeing each other now, or maybe translucently, or maybe only part of the body. And it can involve hearing their voice that seems to be coming from the environment, or that like in your mind's ear, so to speak. You hear the voice in your own mind. And the same with visual. It can be an image in your own mind, or it can be an image out in the environment. People sometimes smell something associated with the person, like a favorite perfume or cigar smoke or something like that. And then there are these other forms that don't involve actually perceiving the deceased loved one directly, but it's indirect through some kind of like symbolic thing. In fact, that's why I wore my butterfly jewelry today, because this is a real common symbolic ADC, where the person, a grieving person, let's say, is on a walk thinking about their deceased loved one, missing them, and suddenly numerous butterflies come and fly around them and even might land on them and so forth. And this has never happened in their life before, and it never happens after that. But it seems to be, they have the definite sense that it's associated. It's kind of like their loved ones sent the butterflies, or the butterflies came in response, as a, like at the beckoning of the deceased loved one. But it can also take other forms. Like I remember one ADC where the deceased person's favorite flower was irises, which usually bloomed in this place in April. And on the anniversary of the death in early January, they walked out their front door, and in their yard, all their irises were in bloom. They were in bloom and, completely out of season.
Wow.
And so, and then they can, like, I remember one case where a woman, a man in my group told me this story. His wife had died, and his, well, actually, she had two that I'll tell. His daughter had these two, and he and his daughter kind of had these two experiences. In one experience, the daughter had gotten engaged, and then her mother was diagnosed with cancer. And then they went shopping for the daughter's wedding dress, and then the mother died, and then the wedding happened. So the mother didn't get to go to the wedding. And a couple of months after the wedding, the daughter posted on Facebook her favorite photo of herself in her wedding dress. And she texted her dad and said, go to the Facebook page and see the photo. So he goes there, he sees it, and he likes it, and then he's going down the list of all the other people who'd seen it and liked it. And his wife had liked the photo, except she'd been dead for about 3 or 4 months at that time. And when he was telling me this, I know. And when he's telling me this, he says, the weird thing is, the only way my wife ever accessed her Facebook was on her phone. I have her phone, but I don't have her password. So I've never been able to get into her phone. So how did she like something on Facebook? This is called an electronic ADC. And they happen, people get telephone calls from the dead. They get computer stuff that happens. Messages come up and things like that. It's just that really, well, the other thing that happened to this young woman, one night she and her new husband were out to dinner, and they had this lovely dinner. And when they finished, they discovered that this restaurant did not take credit cards, and they didn't have hardly any cash between them, except that her mother, like a couple of years before, had given her 4 $50 bills to plant in different places so that if she was ever short on money, she would have it. Well, her last one of these 4 bills was in her wallet, and she could either use it or they could wash dishes, So she very reluctantly used this $50 bill. And so after dinner, they went to Target to shop. And as they turned a corner of an aisle, it was to the makeup aisle, she commented to her husband, "Oh, I feel so nostalgic because this is where Mom and I used to come to do our makeup shopping together." And as they're walking down the aisle, they see something in the aisle. And as they approach it, it's a $50 bill laying right in the aisle.
Wow.
And so manifestations of physical things can happen. And so I've given a lot of examples of people who had these experiences when they were awake, but these experiences can also happen during sleep. And I don't call them dream ADCs because when people have these experiences while they're asleep, they usually will say, this was nothing like my normal dreams. This was a real experience while my body was asleep. And I typically met my deceased loved one and had some kind of communication, although it can take a different form, which I had personal experience with it, but it's too long of a story to tell you right now. But so it can happen when we're awake, when we're asleep, in any state of consciousness. It can happen when we're completely healthy, all the way to being on our deathbed. And like I said, this is where ADC kind of overlaps with nearing death awareness, because the dying person seeing a deceased loved one who's there to help them across, that's kind of like after death communication too. So these categories are a little bit artificial because they all kind of overlap, but anyway, so and one of the things we know about after death communication is it's almost always pleasurable, and it almost always helps the experiencer in some way. It might help them with a very specific problem they're dealing with. Like, people have had after-death communications about like lost wills and things like that, where they then have like a dream or a vision or experience of some kind where they're shown where this will is located, and they go to this obscure place that no one would ever think of, and they find the will and, you know, have what they need. There's a great interview that one of my colleagues did with a man named John, whose father passed, and a few days later he was at his mother's house helping her clean out, and he remembered that his father had told him a couple years before that his father had bought a small gun for protection, and he had put it in the top shelf of the closet but he said he hadn't told his wife, which was John's mother. And he said to John, you know, if ever anything happens to me, if you'll go get the gun and take it out of the house, because your mom won't know what to do with it. So John's thinking, okay, here I am. So he goes up and he's searching in the closet. Well, long story short, he searches everywhere. He cannot find the gun at all. And so he just kind of is giving up on it. And a couple nights later, he has this experience while he's asleep, that he's in his parents' house. His father is upstairs, and John is walking down the steps into the basement, and his father's calling from above and saying, yeah, go downstairs. And John's saying, no, Dad, I've looked everywhere down here. And his father says, no, keep going down the hall into my dark room, and now go across the room to this cabinet, and now pull the cabinet away from the wall, and there you'll find the gun lodged between the cabinet and the wall. And so John has that experience while he's asleep, and then he doesn't wake up immediately. He wakes up in the morning and remembers this experience in the middle of the night, and he's thinking, you know, could this be? Nah. But then it's bugging him. So he goes to his mom's house. He says, Mom, I'm going to check in the basement, look around for something. And she's like, okay. So he goes downstairs. He goes into the dark room to the thing. He pulls the cabinet, and there's the gun lodged between the cabinet and the wall. And he says, you know, he has absolutely no memory that his father ever said anything to him about the gun, except the one time when he said that he kept it up in his closet above shelf. So these experiences sometimes are even veridical, meaning that the person gets information that they couldn't have gotten through any normal means, and is later verified as accurate, which then casts what's the opposite of doubt? Belief on the experiences that don't involve veridical information, that the sense people have that the experience is absolutely real. It might absolutely be real, objectively speaking, you know. So yeah, so I've said a lot. I've yacked. What reactions do you have?
Everything is so fantastic. I love everything that you're saying, and I love all of the stories. It's amazing the stories that I've heard since my mother passed, and the stories that I can now share with everything that all the afterlife communication that I've had with her, and, you know, the stories that my sister has had with her that she shared with me. It's really amazing. It really shifts beliefs. It helps reconcile grief. Perceptions of what happens in the afterlife completely shifts. It's a reaffirming of what I experienced when I was little after my grandmother passed away, you know, and the continued things that happened, you know, as I was growing up, for sure. So I think it really is a beautiful experience to have these afterlife communications, because it really affects you on multiple different levels.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it can help with grief. It doesn't completely eliminate grief, because you know, she's still not here, and you know, there is that definite loss, and at the same time, there's a definite sense of an ongoing relationship and ongoing connection, and that your death isn't the end of the connection, and maybe changes your beliefs about even what's important in life.
Yes.
Yeah. What would you say you have thought about is most important in life based on these experiences?
That life is so precious. It really is a gift and it's limited. And when our loved ones aren't in physical form anymore, we miss them.
Yeah.
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 And yeah, it's just, cherishing every moment that we have with our loved ones. And
Mhm.
yes, we will see them again. And yes, we do have this communication, but it's loving glimpses and little messages. It's, not that physical form where we can call mom on the telephone and see what's going on, or have
Yeah.
her present in our lives, or, my children's lives.
Yeah, for sure. For
Mhm.
sure. So there's some aspects of the loss that the communication isn't gonna change, but some aspects that it does ease and make better.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Wow.
feeling that, okay, mom still is around. She's
Hmm.
still here. She's still supporting, still loving us from afar. But yeah,
Yeah.
we still do very much experience that grief and loss, and it gets triggered by the most interesting things, I find.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Unexpected, right?
Unexpected things. Yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well,
But it does bring, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, you please go ahead.
But it does bring a sense of peace, like you were saying,
Hmm.
that shared death experience. I know that when I was in the hospital sitting beside my mother, holding her hand, I very much did see and feel that my grandmother and great grandmother were there.
Mm.
And I heard, we've got her. Me hoping, we've got her, we're going to help her
Yeah.
heal. Right? That's what I
Yeah.
was really cheerleading for. Right. But,
Yeah.
also knowing, that she could possibly be in her death process, and um, see, experience, or going through the experience in my mind now, post her passing, I see that she was in her death process, and
Hmm.
they were there helping her and supporting her,
Yeah.
as she was going through her process. And um she was on a ventilator, and because her lungs had filled up with fluid, and not able to communicate, post a certain time. So it
Hmm.
was comforting to know that they were there with her and
Hmm.
supporting her, and from the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's what a great gift. And also a little side aspect of it was by them conveying that message to you, it did help you begin to consider the possibility that she might be passed in the process of passing,
Mhm.
and helped you not be so shocked by her passing. Just, getting you starting to consider that possibility.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
great.
That's a really nice way to put it, to consider the possibility, because that is very true.
Yeah.
As much as I didn't want to, yes, in the back of my head, that was a considered possibility. So it did ease
Yeah. Yeah.
it.
Hmm.
Mm.
Well, one of the things that we've sort of touched into or referenced in a very indirect way
Mhm.
is the possibility for people to facilitate this experience, because the great majority of experiences that people have of this type occur unexpectedly, unintentionally, and often when people, when you'd like to be able to just communicate with your deceased loved one, you can't just, like you said, pick up the phone, or even in a spiritual way, pick up a phone and get that communication on demand. But there have been um, uh, strategies that people have used to facilitate that communication. And they include things like automatic writing, sitting down with a pen and paper, and the intention to allow the deceased person to communicate through one's own pen, with letting go of control and letting the writing kind of happen. um, and so some people have have a definite sense of connection with their deceased loved one that way. And then there's mediumship, which is using a medium of communications, an intermediary between the living person and the deceased person, to get a communication from the deceased loved one. And there are a couple places that people can go to find, like there's a place called the Windbridge Institute, Windbridge, one word, where they have a list of certified mediums. These are mediums that they have, you could say, put through their paces to make sure that they really can reliably connect accurately with deceased loved ones. And then there's just some mediums who have very good reputations. And like, for example, one person who's spoken several times at the International Association for Near-Death Studies is Suzanne Geeseman, who is a retired attaché to I think the head of the Navy on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So she was very high in the military, and something happened in her life that opened her to her capacity for mediumship. And she's just has amazing, I always look forward to hearing her talks at the conference, because she always has new stories to tell and things like that. So, and she calls herself an evidential medium. So she asks for evidence so that the messages that usually come through are like, I'm here, I'm healthy, I'm still with you, I see what you're doing, I'm still involved in your life, I care about you, I love you. None of that is evidential. So she asks for evidence. So I'll tell you one quick story that exemplifies this. So this young woman, her father had passed, and she goes to Suzanne for a reading. Of course, Suzanne doesn't know her from anybody. And at the very beginning of the reading, Suzanne says, well, your father's here and he's showing me shrimp, the crustacean. and she says, does shrimp mean anything in your relationship with him? And the daughter's racking her brain, and she just can't, it isn't making any kind of connection. And Suzanne said, well, he's quite adamant. He wants you to know about these shrimp. And so now we're going to move on. And so they go on, and then Suzanne says one thing after another that's very evidential to her, and she leaves the session on this high. So she goes home, she calls her mother, the widow, and she tells her all about, she's all excited, and then Suzanne said this, and then she says this, and she says, oh, but the weirdest thing, at the very beginning, Suzanne said he was quite adamant that I should see these shrimp. And on the other end of the line, her mother goes, and the daughter says, what? And the mother says, well, yesterday I cleaned out the freezer in the garage, and at the bottom of the freezer was this bag of shrimp. I had no idea how long it had been there. So I took it in the house, I boiled it up. My intention was to put it in, some packages and freeze it again so that I could use it, in dishes over the next few weeks. And she said, but I ate one of the shrimp and it was so good that I ate the whole bag.
That's great.
And what's particularly great about this is that people sometimes say, well, could the medium be reading the sitter's mind? Could Suzanne have been reading that daughter's mind? Well, no, because the daughter didn't know about the guilty shrimp,
That's fantastic.
But her father was letting her know that I see what you're doing, and he wasn't there to guilt the mom about the shrimp. He was there to say, I know what's happening in your life, and I still care. So
that's fantastic. Yeah, that evidence. And we can so often when we go get a reading say, okay, was that evidential mediumship, or were they just, psychically picking up on what I've been doing over the last week? I know that in a recent conversation with a friend, we had that discussion because I had a group reading here with East West Books in Seattle with Mark Anthony. And he's an evidential medium. I've interviewed him on the show. And he, went through like ginger, and I had put ginger in my tea, and then you left the door open and the door to the garage was open, and several other things, that way that were really fun, and glimpses into evidence that she is watching my daily life.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And she's seeing these things happen in my
Yeah.
life. It
Yeah.
really is fantastic when
It
you
is.
come across someone who can give that type of a reading.
Yeah. And then, as you say, then you might come away and wonder, was he somehow picking up on me? Because that's all stuff that I knew. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why these cases, like Suzanne said, are so important, because it was picking up on information that the sitter didn't have, but was
Right.
so on target. So yeah. And again, that casts belief then that in this kind of things that you experienced were genuinely him, Mark Anthony, getting the information from your father that he's, or your mother,
Mother.
rather, that
Mm-hmm.
she's
Yeah.
watching you. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It's
Right.
really,
So, and then there's a counseling technique called induced after death communication.
oh,
And this is I did a study on it in at the University of North Texas. And what we did was, so let me tell you first what is involved in induced after death communication, IADC. The A grieving person comes for counseling, and after the counselor gets to know the person and know the deceased person, the relationship between the client and their deceased loved one, and all that kind of thing, then there is some work around the most painful aspect of the grief for the living person. And once, what happens in that process is that typically the person starts out feeling very emotionally distressed while they think about this worst aspect of the grief. And then this processing is done, and they end up feeling very low, if any, emotional distress. And when they reach that level, and the processing continues, about half of people, a little over half, have a spontaneous experience of after-death communication with their deceased loved one, and the remaining, uh, um, not all the people, but a good portion of the next of the people who don't have it spontaneously, just by asking a couple of questions. These aren't like leading questions. They're questions like, if you could say one thing to your deceased loved one, what would be the single most important thing you would want to say to them? And once they settle on it, then doing some processing around that, sometimes then they have an after-death communication experience. And what we did in the study, we had bereaved people, and we randomly assigned them to either traditional grief counseling, where you talk about the deceased person, what they meant to you, and that kind of thing, how you're getting on in life without them, versus IADC. And before, it involved two 90-minute sessions, 1 week apart. And before the first session, everybody took some instruments to assess their grief. Then they went through their two sessions, either traditional grief counseling or IADC, and then they took those same instruments again so we could see if their grief changed. And the people who went through traditional grief counseling, their grief either did not improve or actually got a little worse. Whereas the people who had IADC had significant improvement in their grief symptoms, and it was what we call clinically significant, not just statistically significant, numbers, but a really meaningful shift in their grief. And I've followed up with a few of the people who said, like one gal, she felt her husband hug her, and she said that, but it was more than that, because she had always questioned whether he really loved her. He was good to her. They had a good life together, everything. But, deep, deep down, did he really love her? And in the experience of him hugging her, she felt his absolute unconditional love. And she said that actually on reflecting on that, this had been a lifelong thing from, the earliest she could remember in childhood is the doubt that many of us have. Am I essentially lovable? And do the people in my life who say they love me, do they really love me? And she said this was the first time that she ever experienced absolute unconditional love. And she said it changed her life. So it changed her life in a bigger way than just resolving her grief.
Wow.
It really changed the very foundation of her sense of her own worth and lovability. And so it's a very powerful approach that research, we can now say research shows is really effective. And not everybody who goes through this process has an after-death communication, although sometimes people have it not during the counseling session, but in the following week or in a few weeks after. It can, for some people, sort of open something that needs something else to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But even when people don't have specifically an ADC, they still benefit from significantly from the counseling, from the whole process. So anybody who's interested in that can Google induced after-death communication and go to the website of the organization for that to find their list of certified mental health. They're all licensed mental health professionals who are also certified in Iadc. And you for those of your listeners who don't know, you usually look for somebody in your own state because licensure, the legal right to practice is usually within a license that's issued by your state. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the web address too. I think that these avenues are important ways for us to process our grief and our emotions, following the passing of a loved one, especially since, I've noticed after the passing of a loved one, it opens up the doorway not only to communication, but also to healing. If there was anything that needed to be healed,
Yeah. Yeah.
arise.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and as illustrated by that one client where there was a deep wound that needed healing, and these experiences can really address those. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Uh-huh. So I'm kind of at a pausing place. What else comes up for you that you might want to contribute or ask me?
Oh, thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really loving all of the stories that you're sharing. I think that our listeners would probably benefit from hearing more stories. I know I've heard a lot of stories since my mother has passed. One or two that I would like to share, especially around that shared death experience. I heard recently of a person who was sitting next to the bedside of a loved one and actually found themselves in an out-of-body experience where they were in the room with the person who was sedated, but on the other side, which I thought was very fascinating. And this was pre the person's passing.
Yeah.
There was another woman who had a similar experience as you were sharing earlier about shared death experience, where she actually had an out-of-body experience or vision where she was walking her husband to the light. And then when she got to the light, sort of handed him off to their loved ones. I think that those stories are amazing.
Yeah.
And then there's after
And
go ahead.
if you hold that thought,
Sure.
I just want to underscore that in the first one you mentioned, it's like the person's spirit or consciousness or whatever word you want to use, their essence had left their body before the body actually died. The body was just sedated, and you'd think that the consciousness would still be in the body, but not necessarily. Yeah.
Right, not necessarily. I know from my own self experiencing a traumatic brain injury in a car accident, when that truck hit broadsided my car, I was having an out-of-body experience. I think that, and as a healer, I can feel the differing energy levels in a person, on my table or in transition, I'm finding now. After working on my mother, there's that, I think, where our spirit does sort of lift up out of the body when it is experiencing something, physical like that. There is a separation. So quite often I have heard a lot of stories about those out of body experiences, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's the first, well, not the first, but it's usually an initial aspect of a near-death experience for the consciousness to be. Some people remember their consciousness actually leaving their body. Some people just are suddenly aware that their consciousness is out of their body. But definitely being outside and observing the material world. Yeah, very common.
Yeah, I love all of the shared experience post as well. The butterflies, the dragonflies. My mother loves hummingbirds and has sent me hummingbirds. My sister has smelled her perfume. My mother does a fun thing with the printer. She actually did it right before our interview, which was fun, just letting me know that she knows what we're going to be talking about.
Oh, wow, how cool.
She does fun thing with my water dispenser, the bubbles. I can be laying in bed, nobody's walking on the floor or disturbing it, and the bubbles will happen. And it even happened to me when I was discussing my mother's passing with a person at a retreat a couple of weeks ago, and we're sitting in front of it on the floor, and as I'm talking, the bubbles happen right next to me, which is I just kind of giggled to myself.
Wow, that is great. That is great. And you're bringing up a really important form, is that a lot of times there will be interference with electrical things, like lights will flash. And even one man whose wife passed, they always used to have dinner in the dining room. And many times he would come home from work, no one has been in the house, and her chair would be pulled out.
Wow.
And so just the movement of things, even in the physical environment, it's amazing all the different forms that it can take.
I actually had that recently. I was standing in the kitchen and my vitamin dispenser was empty. I'm making my tea and it was sitting right behind me, and I heard movement. And I'm like, that sounded like my empty plastic vitamin dispenser just moved, right? But I continue on, right? And it happened again. I heard the sound again. So I turned around. I'm like, okay, maybe you'll want to do it again now that I'm watching.
Yeah.
No. Only when I wasn't watching. Maybe that's all she had. Enough energy. Nudge it a couple times. Yeah, it's really fun. And the lights too.
Pardon me?
And the lights as well. She plays with the lights. A week after my mother passed, my son and I laid in bed and had a conversation with the lamp. Conversation with mom, because it just
it would
flicker and turned off and turned back on again. Yeah, it was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Wow. That is amazing. And another one, I remember when I was teaching high school, so this is like years ago, I had a student whose parents died suddenly in a car accident, and the children were at home. I think there were 4 children in the family, and they got notified that the parents had died. The police came and it was only 20 minutes after the accident had happened, and that's when they noticed that all the clocks in the house had stopped at the time of death. Wow. So goosebumps
again.
I I know. It's just there's so much more going on than just this material world that's very important, and it's not the end be all and end all of everything, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, one one experience that I had involved butterflies. My husband's mother was living alone in East Texas, and one evening, my husband, his name is Gary, and he has a friend named John. The three of us were sitting at our dining table, talking about John's father, who was over in England, and John was trying to figure out what to do. His father's health was failing and this sort of thing. Then we got briefly onto the topic of Gary's mom and how it seemed like she was slipping cognitively, and we're thinking she was going to need to go into, like assisted living or something like that, but she's fiercely independent. While we're having this conversation, I have this feeling of something up in the corner of the room that's like ironic. I don't know how to explain it any other way. I had this sense of a presence that was communicating irony. Now, this is not something that you would say to somebody like, while we're talking about this, I have a sense. It was just something I registered in my mind and thought, oh, okay, very odd. The next morning, I was in a counseling session, in fact, in here, this is my home office, and I heard the phone ring out the door, and I heard my husband answer the phone, and then I heard something that I'd never heard before, since he burst into tears, and my client could hear it too, and the client wasn't talking about something, like really critical, urgent. So I said, do you mind if I step out for a minute? And learned that they had just found Gary's mom. She had fallen in the shower the morning before and died. And she hit her head and she died in the shower. And they had just found her. And then it made sense. While we were talking about what are we going to do with Gary's mom, she's already passed, and she's up there going, y'all don't need to be worried about this anymore. It's just very ironic you're thinking about this, because problem solved. So we immediately packed up and went to East Texas. Gary's aunt put us up. She was so good to us for a few days, and we stayed until the funeral. And at the funeral, I took a flower out of each bouquet and brought it home and tied them up and hung them in our windows to dry, so we would have this nice reminder of her. So a couple weeks later, we're going back, meet Gary's sister, go to the house, to Gary's mom's house, and we're cleaning out. And I saw these canisters that had a monarch butterfly on the front of them. And I said to Gary's sister, would you mind if I break up the set and take this one, which is just like this perfect size, and take it home and clean it up and put potpourri in it and give it to Gary's aunt as a thank you gift for taking such good care of us, during this really hard time. And Gary's sister was, no, that's fine. So I did all that. And then after I had brought Gary's aunt the canister thing, probably, I'm going to guess that it was maybe a week or 10 days later, I was standing at my back window looking out. We have an ivy patch, and as I'm sipping tea, it's morning, nobody else is around, and I suddenly realized there's a monarch butterfly in the ivy, and it's just moving ever so slightly. So I'm waiting for it, to fly away, and it just doesn't. It just keeps moving. And suddenly I realized, oh, wait a minute, the only time it moves is when the leaves are rustling. It's a breeze, that's moving. So I open the door and step out and approach it very gingerly. Well, long story short, it was a perfect dead monarch butterfly, which with its antennae and everything still in shape. It was just so perfect. That's what was on the front of the canister. And so I picked it up and of course, the first time I touched it and all that. And anyway, I ended up taking it and putting it in with the flowers. I hung it on the flowers that were hanging, and it was just perfect. And never before in my life, I'm 72 years old, never before and never since have I found a dead butterfly of any kind, more or less a perfect one, more or less a monarch that's the exact same one that was this meaningful thing. And I absolutely know that that was a message from her about saying, you know, I saw this whole thing and, you know, got it. Yeah,
Wow.
it was great.
Thank you
So,
for sharing that, Janet.
yeah,
That's a great, so Janice, that's a great story.
yeah, yeah. So we've,
Thank
and I'm sure
you.
we probably all both have lots of others and others from other people. They're just,
Yes.
they're very, they're so diverse and usually just so fitting for the exact person. You know, if you'd gotten a monarch butterfly, it wouldn't have
Mhm.
meant the same thing. And so yeah, so it just, they seem to be really designed uh, for the experiencer.
It really is individualized. When you were telling your story, it reminded me, I went to go visit my dad with my youngest in June for his post 90th celebration. And there ended up being something going on with the family. And my youngest and I were walking out of a care center where my dad's wife was recuperating. And up flies in our face this big black butterfly with blue on the tips. And we just stood there because this butterfly just circled us over and over again, like up and down and all around for a solid minute. And we were just, both of us delighted, and Dad was in the car just watching us, kind of giggling at us. And very much both of us felt like we looked at each other and mama. But the butterfly, like you said, is significant because my sister actually has that very butterfly tattooed on her shoulder, on her back.
Wow.
So it is very
Wow.
individualized and such a
Yeah.
gift when it
Yeah.
happens.
It really is. And sometimes I think, wow, like the animal world, especially the butterflies and hummingbirds and all that, seem to be in sync with the spirit world in
Mhm.
a really interesting way. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is very cool.
Very much messengers of spirit.
Messengers of spirit. Yeah, that's a great way to say it. And one thing that's coming to me is to be sure to emphasize that what seems to be the important factor here is love. That
Yes.
love is the link that keeps the communications open and things like that. And also, sometimes people really want this communication and they don't get it, and they wonder why. And it might be another person who isn't even as close to the deceased person as they are, who's getting the messages. And I can't say that I really know why that happens, but I do have some hypotheses about it. And one is that some of us are just generally more open to and sensitive to communication from other dimensions. And so
Mhm.
that can play a role. But also, one of the things we know from IADC work is that that if when a person is emotionally charged in some way, they could be profoundly sad, they could be guilty, they could be resentful. If there's any intense emotional charge, that seems to get in the way of the communication.
Yeah.
And so what helps people most is if they can get into a centered, calm space psychospiritually, in which they invite the deceased to make themselves known and not demand, not pull, but just invite the way you would invite someone to do something. And if they say yes, fine. And if they say no, fine. And then be prepared for the communication to take a form that you absolutely had no anticipation of. And
Mhm.
so just to be open to noticing anything that happens either in the moments following the invitation or in the days or even weeks following the invitation, that sometimes circumstances need to happen so that, like, you're driving down the street thinking about your deceased loved one, you just turn on the radio and there is their favorite song or the favorite song you had with them.
Yes.
And so, you can't make that happen like right now, but it might happen in sometime over the next few weeks. And so it's that centered, open, inviting kind of mindset that seems to facilitate these experiences the most. Yeah.
Oh, I love that you said that, Jan, because it's so true. Just asking and then being open to what you receive. I remember I shared a story in the afterword in a book that I wrote about my share of death experience with my mother that's going to be coming out soon. And in the afterword, I share a story about how we're discussing angels and how one of the things that you can do is to invite the angels to give you a sign, to ask them to give you a sign. And we had walked into the nursery and we were just walking around, and I had my second born with me. He was a toddler at the time and he had white blonde hair. And a woman walked up to us out of nowhere. We didn't even realize she was there. And she goes, "Look at that angel hair." And that was the sign. I just looked at
Yeah.
mom and we just both looked at each other like, "Oh, there it is."
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
obvious, like you wanted an angel sign. Here's a woman showing up that says angel,
There.
so
Yeah.
be prepared for it to show
Yeah.
up the way that you hear it, the way that you would see it. And know, I like what you said also, know like when when you're experiencing it, if your loved one is in your mind, that's affirmation. That's
Mm-hmm.
confirmation. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that it is your loved one giving you that sign. That's
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
confirmation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So there, one of the kind of unanswered questions for me is who benefits most from like going to a medium versus doing IADC? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
some people benefit from both. Maybe one order than the other is better for some people than others. There's still a lot of questions I have about how best to help people with grief around these kinds of experiences. But I do know that there are plenty of times that people have spontaneous, really unexpected, unplanned experiences, and just processing those in depth with another person is knowledgeable and has an open attitude can really mine the riches of the experience and really deepen it and help you kind of milk it for everything it's worth. And reflecting on it over time. I mean, I have an after death communication experience that was a mystery to me for, I don't know, more than 20 years. And one day something happened that I suddenly got it. And it was just amazing. And I even understood why it needed to be a mystery to me for those 20 years, that I had reached a point where I was able to really receive the message that I couldn't have received previously. So even just staying with these experiences over time, revisiting them, they can be so beneficial. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's important for people to hear. I appreciate that.
Sure, sure.
Well, it looks like we're coming to the end of our hour, Jan. Is there anything that you would like to share extra, a little pearl of wisdom or a gem to leave us with?
Hmm. I'm coming back to um, love, and that love is the link. That's the name of a book that a colleague of mine wrote years ago. But I thought in that title she really captured it. Love is the link, and when we establish a loving relationship with another person, we're we're establishing a relationship that isn't just for this lifetime, it's for beyond, and possibly that existed prior to this lifetime. And so these experiences fall into even a broader category of things like past life memories and that sort of thing that bring a very different worldview about the nature. You know, we think we're just here born by accident into this family and that sort of thing, that there may be purpose and meaning beyond that, that these kinds of experiences can lend a little peek into. Yeah.
Perfect. I love that, Jan. Thank you so much. And thank
Thank
you for
you.
sharing, the stories and, the resources for us and the tips and ideas, of things if we want to have an experience, what might we be able to do, to initiate those in our lives. Thank you for sharing those. I appreciate that.
My
And thank you
pleasure.
for being with me again on Raise the Vibe with Liz. I really
Thank
appreciated
you,
having you again,
Liz.
Jan.
I've thoroughly enjoyed this time with you. Thank you.
Thanks. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Liz Peterson, and this is Raise the Vibe with Liz. You can find me on Facebook, YouTube, and at Raise the Vibe with Liz, and more information on my website, Liz's Healing Touch. I'm also looking for sponsorship. So if you're interested in sponsoring the show, please visit my website, lizshealingtouch.com, and you can find my contact information there. Thank you, Jan. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining me. Have a great day. And remember to get out there and raise the vibe. Thanks, everyone.